Hey there, Matt Nelson coming to you here with a Field Checkup Friday video. This one is talking about planting this next week. It's April 7th, and seems like plant 2023 is here. And I wanted to kind of talk through some of the data showing what we know about the weather and also planting corn or soybeans this early. This is kind of rare for us to have a forecast that looks this good and a planting window that looks like it may stay open for several weeks in April, especially when you could contrast it to last year where it really wasn't fit for much activity in this month at all. So, looking at the Iowa State Mesonet in terms of our soil temps as of now, April 7th, as you can see, most of the state getting close to 50. Exceptions would be southwest of Des Moines, where we got some rainfall this past week as the storms moved through, and obviously in the eastern part of the state as well. That those wetter soils are going to diffuse heat a little more slowly, take a little bit longer to dry out, and also to warm up. Iowa State's now got a nice function where you can actually kind of extend out the forecast for what those soil temps will be. So as we go ahead to the 13th of April, so now we're talking about the middle of next week. So you can see we've got really nice soil conditions, right? Those are going to be in the 60s. That's ideal planting weather. So we always talk about it being fit to plant. That soil shouldn't be too wet, so you're not smearing those sidewalls, and you're able to close those furrows back up. And then obviously you need to have, we like anywhere, around 50 degrees planting into a warming trend, right? We're going to get warmer. And that's certainly what the forecast is showing from a soil temperature perspective. As we go to the temperature and the moisture outlook, so this is from the CPC, the Climate Prediction Center, they're showing for much of the Midwest, we should have above normal temperatures. That's good. So this is valid, through the 20th of April. Kind of unseasonably warm as you think about the way the last few springs have been. We've been very cold in April, right? It has not really been great weather from a planting perspective, and this kind of shows that we're bucking the trend of the last few springs. As we look at moisture, it's somewhat of a mixed bag. So if you're on the eastern half of the state, it should be near normal. So think about what normal means. Periods of wet, periods of dry. Some years, it tends to be wetter, and other year, we've had some very dry springs. So I think we'll for sure move away from that. And those dry, as we get towards normal, that means the possibility of delays, especially in central Iowa where we've got a lot of heavy soils. If you're on the western part of the state or in the plains, we start to see maybe catching a little bit more moisture than normal, which for that area, quite frankly, would be a welcome relief. And I don't know it would delay fieldwork all that long because of how dry those areas are. But again, 35 seems to be kind of the divider right now from a moisture perspective. Wanted to talk about the forecast. I think this is what has everybody activated and excited, and certainly has my phone ringing quite a bit. So as we look at this week, this is Friday the 7th, you can see we've had some really low overnight temperatures, 21, 30, very cool soil temps overnight. And soil temperature in general kind of tracks that ambient air temperature pretty closely. It always lags behind by a number of degrees. But as we look at next week, gosh, it's excellent conditions. A lot of upper 70s, even some low 80s at times, overnight lows in the upper 40s. That's where we want to be. This is unseasonably warm for April. And, this is about a week ahead of before we even started to think about planting in 2022. Look ahead to that next week, showing maybe some chances of rain in there, but in general, again, 60s, maybe some 70s, soil temps in the mid to upper 40s. So again, continued good weather for planting, and the last week of April kind of shows the same. But spring weather is tricky, guys. It's fickle, and those of you with a lot of experience in agriculture should should understand that better than anybody. Just going back 3 days to April 4th, when I pulled this forecast in AccuWeather, this is what it showed. By the time we got to the 18th, some rain, a lot of clouds and cool weather for almost a week. And look at some of those overnight temps. The 19th, 20th, 21st overnights in the upper 40s or upper 30s, excuse me. If that dips much lower and we have those sustained conditions with the cloudy weather, those soils will really drop in temperature and they won't change much. So with that rain, you could have some risk of imbibitional chilling, where those seeds absorb cold water and it actually can cause some of those cells to rupture on those plants as they try to push their tissue through and out the soil surface. And also, if you just planted, say you planted 15th, 16th, 17th, do you really want the first week of that soil's life in the soil to be with 55-degree temperatures and soil temps possibly dipping below 40 degrees? In my estimation, no. And when we've got temps in the upper 50s hovering right around 60, it takes a while to accumulate GDUs, right? We need 120 for emergence. We don't really start counting until above 50. So you're looking at a pretty slow period of emergence here, where it could take 2 to 3 weeks possibly to get those seeds out of the ground. If you're planting on the 10th or 11th, those seeds may come up in 7 days, and that is absolutely a rarity in April. It's not something we're used to seeing. We're used to seeing a nice window, sticking some seeds in, it turning cool, and those seeds sitting there for 3 to 4 weeks, and maybe having issues with emergence. Okay, I wanted to show a study here. This is from some internal research from Illinois. Jason Carr at TDR over there did this research over 3 growing seasons, looking at essentially a host of planting dates from early March through a more normal to late timing, and planting corn and soybean, and looking at both stands and the yield that we got afterwards. So here's some of the details here from this study, and including the maturities that he planted. First, let's look at soybean stands. So again, 2020, 2021, 2022 data. What you see is in these earlier March timeframes and into early April, we saw severe stand reductions, right? Below 80,000 in a couple cases. Those were actually caused by frost. Those soybeans were planted early in good conditions. They came up, they were injured by frost. As we get into April and May, we see those stands much higher. In some cases, we really didn't lose any plants. Should not be a shock, right? We can catch a frost here in the first week of May, sometimes even as late as the 10th of May. It's happened even in central Iowa before. So we know having beans emerged for that long is a risk. And if you go back, to planting beans on the 10th or 11th, they may come up in 7 days. Are we comfortable with that risk, with them sitting out for 3.5 weeks with the possibility of, incurring some damage due to frost? This maybe will help relieve some of those fears, however. Looking at the yield from those planting dates, what we see is the yield level was still really, really high. Stands of 50,000 making 75 bushel beans. Stands of 55,000 making 71 bushel beans. And as we get into May, you see that yield curve really start to decline. And that shouldn't be a surprise. That's what the data says. The decline for corn is much more rapid, which means planting beans later is always a better option than corn. But we do know that yield can kind of start to go off a cliff once we hit, May 15th through the 18th, somewhere around that time frame. What this shows here is the ability of those soybean stands to be resilient and compensate for that loss. And how do they do that, right? Well, the reason we plant beans early is to get more vegetative growth before flowering sets in. And especially planting fuller season soybeans, not early season ones early, we get bigger plants, and that leads to that pickup in yield and that compensation. They can grow out and down the rows to fill in the gaps for those missing plants. They also, as I mentioned, Jason also planted corn in these studies early, and what I see is really remarkable, and that's, go back a slide, in those early April windows, April 10th, even through like the 20th, we actually see a penalty to planting corn that early. This is a 3-year study, so obviously year to year is different and conditions are different and will always drive what happens, but across 3 years, there was a pretty significant penalty to that idea of, I'm going to go out and just stick corn on the ground on April 10th, let it sit there for 4 weeks, and then come up. And really the optimal window is that 25th of April on into, say, May 15th. And in Iowa, again, that kind of matches up with what we know our optimal corn planting window usually is. Okay, so planting corn early, just some pros and cons. So obviously you've got more days to plant. If we think about being wetter in May, if we flip to normal conditions, we could see some delays in that period where we would normally plant. So, making hay while the sun shines is a pro for sure. More days for that plant to develop, right? More GDUs are going to be available to you. Your pollination is going to occur earlier. If we have corn out of the ground by the end of next week, we might be looking at pollination around the 4th of July. Not knee high, we'll be tassel high by the 4th of July. And that, that means more moisture and hopefully some cooler temperatures. We're also going to get shorter plants. When we plant later, a lot of times those plants shoot up out of the ground quickly. They grow very tall, trying to capture as much sunlight and get as big as they can as quickly as they can, which means a skinnier stalk. And that can lead to some issues late in season. And also relative maturity, right? If we're planting that early, we're going to finish out earlier. Harvest will be earlier. It'll really change our harvest schedule around in a good way. It'll, have us doing more work in September than November. In terms of some cons, so cool soils early. Obviously, we've already talked about that, right? Planting seeds and letting them sit in the ground for 4 weeks usually causes some issues with your stand establishment. Risk of cold injury and bibitional chilling if we've got cool rain moving in or big swings in temperature. One thing we don't talk about very often, but variation in temperature and moisture across the field. So I'm going to really spotlight this one because we see this a lot, especially with residue or with fields that have variable soil types. The temperature is not uniform across that field, and the moisture is not either. And sometimes in years where it's too dry, those dry spots, there's not enough moisture for quick germination, so it takes a while. In other places, residue keeps that temperature cooler, so that soil doesn't warm up as fast and doesn't dry out as fast. And seeds there maybe take a lot longer to come up. So that's one of the risks we take when it's early. We haven't had as long of warm temperatures to evenly warm and dry out those fields, so you should expect to see some variable emergence, but we're hoping that they don't emerge much later than a week, maybe a week and a half later than those other seedlings. Longer we let those seedlings sit out there without much growth, we face risk of injury, damage to the mesocotyl, disease, until that plant can get that root system established, which usually doesn't happen until we're after V3, right? So if you get it planted, everything comes up, looks good, but then the weather turns off and really stinks, and nothing really grows for 3 weeks, that corn is at risk. That does not have a root system yet. That's anything to write home about. So there is some risk there. And then with corn, obviously, if we have a poor stand, guys, it's impossible to repair. We can't go out and plant into the rows. We can't plant across the field like we can with beans. A lot of times, if the stand is damaged that badly, we're looking at a replant if it was a really early planting date. For beans, the cons are pretty similar, but the pros are different. So with beans, we're getting a bigger canopy. We're putting on more growth, which means a couple things. It means we're going to close the rows faster, which is better for weed control. It's better to help conserve soil moisture. We're going to absorb maximum radiation. My neighbor and my coworker always jokes that with beans, you're a sunlight farmer. Well, you can harvest the most sunlight when you have bigger plants. That longer growing season, planting early can kind of stretch out that reproductive growth stage in that part of the year. So essentially what that means is you're going to get, when you have bigger plants, by the time you get to flowering, you should have more nodes in the main stem, which means more flowers, more pods, more seeds, right? Bigger plant, more nodes, more yield. You could also have an earlier harvest, kind of in corn like we talked about. And probably the biggest one, right? If you've got stand issues, you can fix them. You can drive across the row and plant 60,000 at an angle. There's a lot of ways to correct soybean stands, and in some cases, like the data showed us earlier, they can sort of compensate for that loss naturally, which we know corn can't do very easily. Cons, again, issues with germination due to cold, a lot of the same issues with soil temperature and chilling injury. The big one is, for me, is frost risk, right? We can catch a frost here in the first week of May. We've had one as late as May 12th here in the last 10 years. And that can cause huge problems, right? Now you're talking about replanting vast acres of beans, because with corn, they're protected. That growing point is below ground until around V5. And frost can get into the soil if it's dry and the soil is cloddy, but really with frost, we're more worried about beans. So that's clearly the main risk. So that's what I've got for data. I hope you've enjoyed kind of this breakdown. This is what the conditions tell me, and I wanted to show you based on that what the data says. In my personal opinion, as you look at the pros and cons, the big pro for soybeans is yield. The way to 85 bushel beans is planting in April. It almost always is. We don't really see that when we plant in May. Obviously, conditions and in-season weather has a lot to do with that. And the other thing I like about planting beans early is the ability to correct that stand. However, as early as it is, I would really recommend going out with some corn until we hit, the middle of May, the 15th to 16th, because I don't really care to have beans emerged on April 16th and sitting out for 3 to 4 weeks with the possibility of being killed by a frost. With corn, we've got that protection. So I think if in an ideal scenario, you have two planters and you start both. Overall, I would encourage you to take it slow. This second week of April will most likely not be the best window that we get. You need to keep your insurance dates in mind as well. Usually it's around April 10th. I think this year it's the 10th and the 20th for beans. So normally we want to be cautious about planting before those dates. But this is just a look at what the data shows me. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.